the next thing. Okay. All right. So we are looking at the song America from West Side Story as it compares to the story of the Chet HaMeraglim, the sin of the spies entering into their own promised land. And having just watched that movie clip from the 1961 film of West Side Story, I just have to say, wow, it's delightful. And the way that not only the music, but the dancing contributes to this debate that they're having about the dream of America and then the disappointment with that dream is so compelling. I don't know if you noticed, but I hadn't really noticed this before, the way the men are dancing America and then fighting each other in America, even just with their bodies demonstrating the tensions. And I noticed some people kind of singing and dancing along. We have to just give homage to Mr. Bernstein for that incredible piece of musical work, which we're not here to discuss, but right, the timing, it's movement, it's compelling, it takes your breath away. So it's lots of fun. And I didn't know, thank you, Marilyn or Calvin, whoever was writing this, in that this was 62 years ago. My goodness. Lyrics by Stephen Sondheim. Thank you. So I'd like to start, and I love people putting things in the chat. I'd like to start just by fleshing out exactly what we're looking at in the lyrics. I'm about to share my screen with those lyrics, if you give me a moment. So before we look at the Torah text, we're going to take a closer look at the lyrics of West Side Story. Here we are. And please do put into the chat these two sides, these two different emotional pieces. Oh, can I see the chat while I'm sharing? I think I can. Okay. Those who embrace America and those who have rejected America. And I do see the comment about the relevance of this conversation about America in the days before the US elections. As I said at the beginning, we're not going to discuss politics, but there certainly is a deep relevance to the conversation around race that shows up in this piece, and around opportunity or lack thereof, and this polarization of the way people feel about the country. So, so the side that is maybe not rejecting, okay, Anita, I hear, maybe just cynical about their experience or be hardened by their experience of the country. What are they feeling? So where we want to be thinking is not just about America, but about the idea of the promised land. That's where we're heading. The sin of the spies is the story of having sent the 12 scouts, the 12 spies from the wilderness toward the Holy Land, toward the land of Israel, to come back with a report. So these are the first ones, not yet immigrants, but the first ones to have seen what life is really like in the promised land. And they're going to come back and give a report. So for these characters in West Side Story, Bernardo, Anita, Rosalia, the girls and the boys, as it says in the lyrics here, some are saying life is all right in America, and that you can be free to be anything you choose, and the others are saying, well, you're free to wait tables and to shine shoes. Crime and grime and terrible times. So what their experience of America, what those who have embraced and benefited or feel the benefit of America are experiencing what? They're experiencing the freedom, the opportunity. Look at the images of the sunlight. I'm seeing some comments in the chat. Please keep them coming. And on the other side, those who are cynical are fearful, right? They're feeling their vulnerabilities. They're feeling the hardship, and they feel their smallness, and that actually will come into play in the text of Chet HaMeraglim, of the sin of the spies. So Randa is writing, the women who were primarily homemakers at that time seemed to like being in America. And the men who came to America for a new life and had to be breadwinners seemed to want to go back to the old country. So it's so interesting. The male experience is very different because they have to go out there and make it work. And so the men may have felt emasculated in their new land. Maybe they were being told, you're going to be the breadwinners, you're going to find strength, renewal, opportunity, and they get doors slammed in their face. And the women are singing about the washing machines and the everything free, and the skyscrapers that they see. That's a really interesting observation. And then the next comment is that based on the different socioeconomic facts, both of these realities are true. Yes, and something that I want to move toward in our conversation about the land of Israel is the way that both of these are true. And sometimes, especially with the sin of the spies, it had to do with one's perceptions, or which story, which narrative do they want to tell about this promised land. But of course, both of those narratives are true. Both of those realities are very much present for the women and the men. And it's interesting. It's an interesting choice for this America to be a conversation also here about gender, aside from a conversation about race. Any other observations? Please feel free to keep putting them into the chat. Men are feeling hopeless and women are showing hope for the future. Yeah. So I want to move to the Chet HaMeraglim, the sin of the spies. We're actually picking up here in the book of Numbers, Bamidbar, in the middle of the story.
Excuse me, Rachel, my text is blurred now. It was clear
Oh,
before.
no.
One.
It's blurred for others? Okay, thanks for letting me know. So I'm going to just stop and start it again. It's the oldest trick in the book. And let's see if that will work. Give me a moment. Is that better? Can you see it now? No. Okay. Then I'm going to do something else. I have a feeling it's because of it might be this document. I'm going to go right to my source in the Safaria website. I don't know, but here it is. Just give me a minute. Okay. So now I'll share the screen one more time. Can you see this?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Wonderful. So actually, this is perfect because this is the part I'm not focusing on, but we get to see that they're sending out the spies. And it lists the names of these 12 men. So gender is not going to be at play here, or maybe it is always at play because these are only men. And yet, sorry, I'm going to make sure that I also have my chat in view. I can see everything. Okay. And thank you, Anita, for clarifying. The Broadway score doesn't, I was thinking about whether Sondheim wrote it for men and women, but the Broadway score doesn't designate the men or the women's lines. This was a choreography and staging choice for the film. Thank you. That's really interesting. So these are the men that Moses sends out and gives them this assignment. Where they are is they're still in just year 2 after they have left Egypt. Those of you who took my course in the book of Numbers know that the first many chapters of the book of Numbers take place just in the first few months, well, the first year or two. The chapter, the book begins in beginning of year 2, and it's the first couple of months of year 2. They haven't really moved or traveled anywhere. And now they're going into the land, these 12 spies, these Meraglim, these scouts, to see what this place looks like. And for 40 days, 40 being really a number of transition in the Torah. We just read Parshat Noach last week, the 40 days of the flood. So for 40 days, they scout the land and they come back with a report. So What I want us to listen for as we read this are those two camps, those two groups, just like we saw in the movie, the two groups that have these two different attitudes about their promised land. So there are going to be two camps within the nation, two different responses to the, or within the spies, actually, two groups within the spies, two different responses to what they've seen in the land. So the 10 spies are going to come back fetching and complaining and being afraid to go into the land of Israel. And the two, Yehoshua and Caleb, Joshua and Caleb, will be hopeful and optimistic. So they went, I'm now reading from verse 26. They went straight to Moshe and Aharon and the whole community. So they're standing before a big crowd, you could imagine. And they give this following report. First, they show them the fruit of the land. They had been told, bring back some produce, show us the fertility of the land. They had also been asked about the nature of the cities. Are they fortified? Are they not? And at first, it seems they're doing exactly what Moses asked them to do. They come back, they say, this is the fruit. And verse 27, we hear their voices. And again, I'll jump between the Hebrew and the English, so feel free to follow in whatever is most comfortable for you. Vayisaprulo vayomru. They said as follows to him, meaning to Moses, but in front of everyone. Banu el haaretz asher shlachtanu. Yes, we came to the land, and it does flow with milk and honey. Zavat chalav u'devash. And here is its fruit. And then here's where things turn with this one word, ephes. Ephes in modern Hebrew means zero. It's nothing. It means nothing. It doesn't matter that this is a land of opportunity, of freedom. I mean, I can already hear the echoes of the song here, because it's a scary place. It's a place where we are the weak. Ephes ki az ha'am. The people who inhabit the country are powerful. Az ha'am hayoshev ba'aretz. And the cities are fortified, right? The streets are dangerous. There's gang violence. I mean, I'm just now we're melding these stories together. So the Anakites, there are many ways of understanding who the Anakites are. It might be a name of a nation, as it's implied here in the translation, or it might be Anak is giants. These are giants, and you'll see them reference the giants. So we feel really small and weak. And you know who's in the Negev? Amalek. They're one of our worst enemies. And these other nations, the Chiti, Emori, Yebusi. So these inhabitants are scary. They're our enemies. And the Canaanim, the Canaanites, are along the sea, along the Jordan. So every part of this land has inhabitants that are threats to us. That's the first camp, right? The camp that feels threatened and afraid. Caleb leads the other camp, a much smaller voice. Verse 30, Vayahas Caleb et ha'am el Moshe. Caleb hushed the people before Moses, or perhaps directing them to Moses' leadership. He stands up and he says, Alo na'aleh, let us go up. Remember this verb, na'aleh, which is the same verb as aliyah. When we make aliyah, we are going up. We're going up to Israel. So he says, let's make aliyah. Okay, so the quality of life there is not what we're used to in North America. Okay, it's imperfect. It's a scary place, but let's go up via Rashnu Ota. Let's possess it. Ki yachol nuchal. We can do it. We can overcome the challenges. Unfortunately, he's overruled. The men who had gone up with him said, we cannot attack the people. They're stronger than we are. Chazak hu mimenu. Again, this emphasis on our weakness and their strength. And this is the point where we talked a little bit more in depth in our Book of Numbers class. This is where they really start to sow gossip and negativity and sort of damaging stories spreading around the nation. Vayotziu dibat haaretz. This phrase, they spread calumnies about the land. This phrase is the phrase that many of the commentators zoom in on as really the site of the sin itself. Not only did they give their report and express their fear, but then they went and chattered around from tent to tent around the nation and whispering to everyone and kind of growing, fomenting rebellion. They went and spread these words around the nation, and they said, this is a land that devours its settlers. Eretz asher avarnu ba laturota, this land that we went to visit. Eretz ochelet yoshveha. It's a land that eats its inhabitants. It will eat us up. It will destroy us. I mean, the voice of those singers is really in my ears, right? We're not going to survive this. And everyone there are men of great size. And further, they say, we saw the Nephilim, the Anakites, etc. Look at the bottom, at the end of verse 33. We looked like grasshoppers to ourselves. We were kechagavim be'einenu kechagavim, in our eyes. And so we must have looked to them. Actually, must have looked is an English insertion into the text. The plain sense of the Hebrew is, we looked like grasshoppers in our eyes, v'chein hayinu be'einehem, and so were we in their eyes. That's how we looked to them. We were like grasshoppers in their eyes. And this too is a judgment call. How do you know what they see in you? How are you judging what the other nations are seeing when they see the Israelites? But because you feel so small, you feel so weak, you're sure that that's how they see you too. I want to go into the chat for a minute because there's some interesting pieces here. So the Broadway score also points out they are actually Americans from Puerto Rico, but they're not recognized as such. Interesting. So there's a lot of the immigration conversation can come up here. The film misses that verse. I think it is relevant for the Jews coming back to the promised land where they belong. Thank you, Sandy. The Puerto Ricans want to be accepted and to integrate. They want to be accepted as Americanim. The Israelites don't intend to live amongst these people. Yes, this is in contrast, right? They're supposed to fight and conquer them. Yes, so that's important. The differences in these stories really relate to what they're going to do when they get to this promised land. So in America, you want to blend in, you want to be American, and become one of the inhabitants. The Israelites are getting ready for a military encounter, right? A takeover, even though this is the land that God promised them and God says, I am with you, I will help you. They feel connected to it from the days of Abraham. They're newcomers, and they're going to have to settle the land, as they eventually do in the time of Joshua, in a miraculous series of wars and conquerings. And then the response there in the chat, thank you. The Puerto Ricans just want to be given the same choice and opportunities as white Americans. But the Puerto Ricans also see the Anakites, the giant, the impermeable system that works against them, and they are grasshoppers to them. That's right. Thank you. I mean, really, we're not going to talk about U.S. current politics, but just let your mind wander, because it's really interesting. These are timeless conversations. So the focus on so the parallels of having a dream, of feeling disappointed in trying to achieve that dream, or fear about whether it is possible even to achieve that dream. And then these parallels with how we look to them, how they shut the door in our face, how we feel weak. These are also connections. And what happens then, I'm going back to the text, chapter 14, the community falls apart. But Kohl, we're just going to do this briefly. The reaction of the spies becomes a mass sort of mob mentality of woe is us. We can't do this. So the whole community gets caught up in this narrative. They broke out in loud cries. The people wept that night. The Israelites railed against Moses and Aaron. So this was a thread that ran through the book of Numbers, the rebellion against the leadership. They yell at Moses and Aaron. They say, if only we had died in the land of Egypt. Like, it's better for us, even though it was so hard, right? It was so hard where we came from. At least it was predictable. At least we knew what to expect. Let's go back to the land of Egypt. If only we might die in the wilderness. So let's die right here in the wilderness than to suffer through that. Why is God taking us to this land where we're going to fall by the sword, where they're going to take our wives and our children? Let's go back to Egypt. I just have to say, this is not the only time they complain about wanting to go back to Egypt. And sometimes it's, we miss the food. So this is a very valid complaint. It's life and death. But at other times it's, I'm not sure if we're going to survive this. Let's go back to where we had plenty of fish in the Nile. So they say, let's head back for Egypt. And Moses and Aaron don't know how to deal with this. It fell on their faces. Vayipol Moshe v'Aharon al pneihem, in front of the entire community. They don't show leadership in this moment, but instead, verse 6, Joshua and Caleb, the two spies, again, who are in the optimistic camp, who want to embrace the journey into the promised land, they rend their clothes, in other words, in a sign of mourning, and they try. They say to the Israelite community, "Haaretz asher avarnu ba laturota," that land that we saw, tova haaretz, meod meod. It's good, really, really good. And if God wants us to succeed, we will. If we just have faith and we keep pushing forward, we will come to that reality of milk and honey, of zavat chalav u'davash. Just don't rebel against God. Don't be afraid. And look how they flip it around. You think we are small? Have no fear of these people. Ki lachmeinu heim. They are our bread. We're going to devour them. Again, it is a conquering reality that they're looking ahead to. But unfortunately, this is the last verse we'll read for today, verse 10. The people don't listen. They threaten to pelt them with stones, and God now is going to appear and set things right and sort of lament, why do these people keep rebelling? So there's a comment here about the leadership of Joshua and Caleb, and they're rending their clothes. Moses is not. I think there's a vacuum of leadership, to be honest. It's not, Moses was an amazing person, but he ultimately was the man on the mountain, the man of the spirit. And when it comes to practical matters of food, water, military strength, he doesn't respond well. He has simple faith. He's a man of God and not really a man of the people. I don't know about whether he doesn't want to ally himself with Joshua and Caleb. I don't know if it's about that, but thank you for that comment. So we've seen the excitement and the promise and the opportunity of the promised land, and the faith. And then we've seen the cynicism, the fear, the hardship, and the vulnerability of the promised land. And I'd like to look at one last piece before we open it up for discussion. I couldn't resist this because it's not current politics, but it's current parsha. This week's Torah portion is Lech Lecha, is about entering Israel for the very first time. Of course, it's Abraham and Sarah. God says Lech Lecha. And we're not going to look at Lech Lecha itself today, although there is a parallel there of going into the unknown and becoming an outsider, right? In Ivri, Avram is Avram Ahat Ivri. The Hebrew, which comes from the word me'ever, from across the way, from the other. Abraham is other, and he's always going to be an other. But there's a beautiful poem that someone posted. I'm going to just share the screen. I can't do two things at once, like I said. Give me a second. Okay, can you see it? This is Yael Leibowitz. So I actually know her from my days in high school in New York. She made Aliyah. She was a year ahead of me in high school. And in honor of Lech Lecha, she writes this really poignant reflection on having moved from North America to Israel. And it just speaks to as we said before, the coexistence of the optimism and the hardship, of having fulfilled a dream of coming to the promised land, and at the same time being sometimes disappointed or fearful or just hitting harsh realities. So please follow along as I'll read this aloud, and then we'll open it up for discussion. It's called Go and Know. Of course, go is a in the spirit of lech lecha. And she begins with the words of lech lecha. Go from your native land, from your father's home, to the land that I will show you. So those are the words of lech lecha. And now she moves on. Go from your siblings and their children that you love almost as much as your own. Go from your grandparents that you're terrified to leave because they are frail and their hands tremored when you told them. Go from your colleagues and your accomplishments. Go from your childhood friends that you can never make again because they know, so they laugh at your stories, and only they will ever laugh that way at your stories. Go to the land that he went to, but know it will break your mother's heart, and your children will miss the hugs that only she can give. Go to the land that will make everything sweeter and harder and deeper and right. To the land that will embrace you in its foreignness and its familiarity, its stones, its spices, its love. Go to the land they wanted to get back to all those years and years, but couldn't. Go to the land and you will pinch yourself as you eat waffles drizzled with chocolate on a terrace with your children and think of those thousands of years when they couldn't. Go and watch your children turn into the people you always dreamed they could become as they learn the language and the empathy and the resilience and the pride and the curses and the arguments and the rivers and the songs. Go, but know that when you watch him score baskets, your cheers will be tinged with fear because he is young and able and he loves the country like you taught him to. Go, knowing they will see and hear things that will make them grow up too fast and grow cynical and believe. Go, so she sees strong women everywhere she turns, and so she loves her curly hair. Go, so they will never have to. Go with faith and with fear, with longing, with yearning towards the flag in the sun. Go with confidence because he went to the land he was promised, your future. Wow, huh? So we're going to pause there. And the best way to do the unmuting is if you put up your hand, you can put up your real hand or your virtual hand. I just, when she says to the faith and the fear, I just, that was ringing all of these other texts in my ear. Because we go to our promised lands, right? We make the decisions that we make, whether it's about moving, making aliyah, or simply about doing what we feel is right, even though it means there are compromises that we make for ourselves and for our children. So now it's just the time for anyone to share their reflections. Raise your hand and let me know if you'd like to have a turn. And you can also keep putting your comments in the chat. We missed just a couple of observations here. The passage is so similar to the story of West Side Story, where the Puerto Ricans destroy themselves from the inside. Right. Yes. The classic Romeo and Juliet story. Yes. When the spies say the land that consumes its inhabitants, Elaine says, they are projecting, their fears and lack of confidence in God. The Puerto Rican men see a reality of prejudice. Thank you. That's very important. It's a long road ahead. Still, like the Israelites, these men need to persevere bravely and believe that one day they will achieve their dreams. It will happen, but it won't come easily. Yes, I think that's true. Other thoughts, whether it relates to the West Side Story, the sin of the spies, the idea of Lech Lecha, the idea of moving to Israel in the face of hardship, destroying themselves from the inside. Well, do you want to share more about Sandy? if you want to unmute yourself and just share more about what you meant about the dynamic in the group of Puerto Ricans, as well as anything else. Not to pick on you, but someone was asking about your comment in the chat.
I was just thinking, because we did this story in the last section, didn't we? When we talked about
in the book of Numbers,
previous thing, and we talked
in the previous iteration of the Wednesday class. Yes.
We talked about that sort of classic ambivalence between sort of known and unknown, but that sort of whole thing of staying tight, and that their actions prevented that whole generation from going into the promised land. Is that correct? I mean, it took a generation, because of the spies, it took a generation for them to go in. But
exactly. After the sin of the spies was when God said, that's it, you're staying here for 40 years.
And
only your children. So that generation sort of, you're saying, ruined it for themselves. Maybe they didn't have a choice. They were slaves. They had the mentality of, of the fear and the smallness.
But that fear sort of led, I think, to the sort of behaviors and the actions that kind of put them back rather than moving them forward, kept them. West Side Story, right? It is that classic where two sides fight each other. So I guess the two sides of wanting to go into Israel and not wanting to go into Israel, and the fighting amongst themselves, and then the actions that prevent the eventual goal. So the deaths of Maria and Tony. No, Maria doesn't die. Tony dies.
Tony.
But it's all of this internal strife and actions that kind of cause the destruction, rather than America on the outside of
it's interesting
against them.
Yeah, I did think more about it, maybe because of the parallel to the sin of the spies. I did think more about it in terms of this minority group against the system or against the land as a whole. Even though you're right, in the story, these two gangs or these two groups fighting against one another, but the immigrants, the newcomers, are against something much larger than just this one.
But the reality is, they're Americans. They're coming and they're acting like immigrants, but they are Americans. Puerto Ricans are Americans.
But haven't they come? Oh, you're saying because Puerto Rico is part of
it is
territory.
It is because they
vote of the United States.
They vote. They're Americans, but they don't see themselves as owning a part in that land. They talk about it like an outsider, but they're actually Americans. And
they do. So Anita has some hand up as well. Is this about this point of the Puerto Rico? Go ahead.
Actually, I was just looking up to see when Puerto Rico became part of the U.S. I think, and I didn't have a chance to finish that Google search.
If anyone else wants to Google that, put it in the chat.
Yeah. I don't. Yes, West Side Story is a classic Romeo and Juliet story. It was based on it, but the story of the spies, I think that the group that didn't want to go into the land, they were projecting their own weakness. That is true. And they were projecting their own failure because as Caleb and Joshua point out, they didn't have the faith that God was going to be with them. But in West Side Story, it was real. They weren't falling apart from the inside. They were up against a group of people who wanted to hold on to their own power. And they saw that white, the Jets were the white power holders in their own little place in Brooklyn or Bronx. I can't remember. But it was emblematic of the entire country that wasn't accepting them. They still didn't have the language. They had a different culture. Whether they were officially American citizens, I don't think was the point. Because they were immigrants and they stayed together like all the immigrant families do. They stayed in their own thing, but they were up against people who wanted to hold on to their power. That was real. The spies were projecting that those other ites, the Hittites, the Jebusites, all the ites, that was a perception that they had their power.
So what we have to also, again, in service of the text, right, in service of the sin of the spies, although the race and immigrants conversations are fascinating, but there's a piece in the sin of the spies that obviously is not at play in the musical, which is that God is there. And God tells them again and again, look, I just took you out of Egypt, and remember those plagues and the sea, the splitting of the sea, like I could do this for you. you just have to have the confidence in me and the confidence in yourself. And they don't have it. They're not able to get themselves to that point. And therefore they rebel and they kvetch and they complain. And God's punishment is, okay, then you don't get to go. Whether it's a punishment or maybe just a natural outcome, consequence of who they are as a nation. It's the same, moving it toward now this aliyah idea, which I just found beautiful and compelling. We're now not fleeing anyone, right? That's the difference between the early waves of aliyah and maybe some people feel now they're fleeing to move to Israel, but we're not fleeing oppression or pogroms, and so the choice to move to Israel is a more complex choice.
Right.
Does anyone else want to make an observation about that, about what it means to go to a modern day promised land? I see a hand from Farla, and I don't know if there was another. Go ahead, Farla.
Well, that poem or what she wrote is so moving. And did you say that you knew her and she moved to Israel?
Yeah. She was a year ahead of me in high school.
Because I just wanted to say that I have a friend who moved in the 1970s and moved her whole family and survived all the wars. And I was visiting her last year, and she said to me, I finally feel like this is the place I belong to. It was so moving when she said that, but it took her almost 50 years to get that feeling that she's part of this. She's part of Israel. And the bravery to go there and stay there, to make that commitment to live there permanently is
when you don't feel that, even if you have the faith, the belief, the opportunity, the excitement, you don't feel that sense of belonging for what you're saying is for a very, very long time. I mean, I have to say this only because I'm not a native Montrealer. I've spoken to many people who have moved to Montreal and 30, 40 years later say, I still feel like an outsider, because here we are in a certain kind of shtetl. And I think Israel maybe has other challenges and other reasons and language reasons for people feeling as outsiders, but it might also be simply part of the immigrant experience. And by the way, I remember someone who moved here not from very far, from Toronto, who said, I will never be a Montrealer. This is a woman in her 70s. Who said, I will always feel like an outsider. From Toronto, nach, just have to say. But go ahead, Pearl. You had something. Oh, sorry, Farla, did you want to finish your thought? And then Pearl, go ahead after.
Is it a lack of involvement that gets you to feel that way? I mean, if you get yourself in the community in a big way, perhaps that's something that makes you feel like you're part of that country.
You're asking really how much is maybe in our power to make that transition go more smoothly. So that we can leave that. I'll leave that hanging as Pearl, go ahead.
No, what I'm saying, you're talking about Torontonians coming to Montreal. There are over 100,000 Montrealers who went to Toronto, and they're still Montrealers in Toronto.
Right.
Not accepted.
There's an identity that doesn't.
Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico was ceded to the U.S. after the Spanish-American War, but didn't become an official part of the U.S. territory until 1917. And Puerto Ricans still today do not feel like they belong to the U.S. They're a territory of the U.S., but they get no respect from the U.S., from people, the government. They live in poverty. They've never received the kinds of funds that other states receive in order to live a decent life. Look what happened after the last hurricane. They've still not recovered, and so many people died as a result, and the president goes and throws paper towels at them. So in terms of wanting to be American, they might want to be American, but they're certainly not accepted as Americans, as true Americans.
Thank you, Pearl. I see Gloria and then Randa. Go ahead. Yeah,
I-
and you
I
can
ju-
give a silent nodding and cheers that's happening in agreement. Go ahead, Gloria.
I want to make a link for all the stories that we're talking about. I think it's a question, it's very primitive, actually. It's when we're children and that individuation phase when we take on our own agency. And I think the children moving towards Israel is, I think we talked about this in our class last year. But they were accustomed to being looked after by God. The manna, everything was being provided for them. They weren't really in control of their own destiny. And I noticed when you were reading the poem, and we were feeling it too, I'm sure you were identifying with leaving the States to move to Canada with your children. You're always your mother and your father's child. And so letting go of that relationship or transitioning to more independence and being the author of your own destiny, it's very hard. And so
Right, right.
we can
I mean, I
be
think,
empathic.
yeah, thank you. Right, and we talked about this story of the Israelites in the wilderness as a bit of a coming of age story, right? Of their growing up from their immaturity as slaves, as dependents,
But it's a time of
to adults.
ambivalence.
And it's a difficult time. I mean, I think what struck me was just the deep loss of those family connections that she writes about, and she acknowledges that will never go away, and nobody will ever hug her kids like their grandparents can. So, and nobody will ever understand how to laugh at her stories. You know, there's a real, there's just a real loss in that move, in being an immigrant, even though you know it was the right decision. Randa, go ahead.
Unmute. This is unrelated to the text, but I wanted to commend you, having lived briefly, just for a few years, in 2 other countries. I learned that, I think, in my opinion, that Montreal is one of the hardest cities to move to, because people are not welcoming and friendly and outgoing. I was shocked when I lived in United States, in Boston and in London, England for a while, and people went out of their way to welcome me. And I attribute part of that to our climate. I think the fact that we have 7 months of winter where everybody's huddled into themselves. You don't talk to your neighbors unless you're shoveling snow. I really realized how Montreal is a difficult city to move to. So
Thank you for saying that. I'll respond actually with 2 things. First of all, I'm thinking about what you said about the snow and the staying inside, and I wonder whether our experience with COVID, having taught us how to connect even when we're indoors, maybe will alleviate some of that the feelings of separateness. I don't know. But I also think, I also have lived in Boston and in New York and in Chicago, and in all of those places, there is an assumption that there are a lot of outsiders having moved in. And so people have a lot of good practice in what it means to be welcoming. And my experience in Montreal is that most of the people I encounter here are from here.
Right.
And it's a harder place to move to because it's hard to move to Quebec, with the language and employment implications. So what I got when I moved here a lot was when I told someone that I was new and I moved here, they said, "Why?" Not the first word out of their mouth was not welcome, was why. And then they go to why and why and why and why until they find out who I'm related to, who's in Montreal, right? Oh, you're so-and-so's. Okay, now we know who you are, right? It's a totally different way of interacting. That's why I call it the shtetl. It's a little shtetl. It's shtetl fabulous in the positive sense of connectedness and tradition and multi-generational families. But there is a culture of having been from here if you're here. And if you're not, I don't think people really have good practice in knowing what it means.
You're absolutely right. That people do not go out of their way here to welcome outsiders, because certainly in my generation, everybody stayed here. Most people went to school here, to university here, and there was not a lot of movement. And so we didn't even bother with outsiders. And it was really pointed out to me when I went elsewhere.
Thank you for saying that. Thank you. And I think it's hard to be, encountering people who've been friends for 30 years, 40 years, and to realize you're never going to be those people to anybody here. Just as Elle was writing. So yeah, thank you.
So we just want you to know that we love you and that we welcome you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. And I think, to Farla's point, I'll be honest, even if you do everything you can to absorb yourself into the culture, there just are barriers. There are barriers. So, and Emily, I see Emily here. I know we've talked about this extensively.
Yeah, we have. Well, you also say that, when I say to you that, we've only been, me and some other of my girlfriends have only been friends for 10 years. And you say only? Like, well, when you
those are
compare
long
it
friendships.
to 35 years with some other people, the 10 years, they're my new friends. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But there is, I think there's I grew up in Ottawa. I feel honored to have broken into this Montreal crowd when I came into McGill, but it's because my parents are from here and they live in Ottawa now. So I was
there you go.
You're
an honorary Montrealer.
Right, I'm the shore representative from my nuclear family here, but it was I think it was said before, a lot has to do with the language. I'm not sure if it was, but a lot has to do with the language, because no matter what, we do live in this, Montreal is actually not a small city, but if you are Anglophone and Jewish, you do live in a ghetto and you are only in the West End. And someone once said to me, would you ever look to live past Saint Denis? And I was like, what? And then they said, you don't need a passport to go there. And I'm like, you're right, but I would never think about moving there because my world is here. And so
right. It shrinks your world.
It's really shrinks your world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So we've reached the end of our hour. It's so interesting the way this conversation meanders.